Greetings everyone and welcome back to The Agent's Angle. I'm Jonathan Booker.
And I'm Peter Paleologos.
We're again about to dive headfirst into a world where deals are brokered, careers are shaped and stories unfold that often remain hidden behind the scenes. It's a realm where football agents play a pivotal role and we're here to unravel their tales, tactics and triumphs.
In this episode of The Agent's Angle, we are joined by a top international sports lawyer and sports agent advisor from the football world, and he will be looking at the topic of visas and work permits for not just players, but also coaches and managers to work in one of the biggest and most competitive football markets in the world, which kicked off earlier this week.
All that to come on this episode of The Agent's Angle.
How are you, Jonathan?
Not bad, Peter. I'm looking forward to spending some time in the sun with the family during the closing weeks of the transfer window and not to have to worry about dropping everything to join some stressful wild goose chase of a transfer. With the professional changes in my area, it's allowed me that time, that little bit of freedom. Now, not many agents will be able to have that, as they'll have to worry about dropping everything, even though they've planned not to and they've got everything in place for their clients and themselves. Now, the last couple of weeks of the transfer window means spinning of plates and juggling various other matters for many other agents. But this year, Peter, how's the window treated yourself and the others you've spoken to, whether it be agents, players, clubs, coaches, managers, and then anybody else involved in the football world?
This window's been quite interesting, firstly because we've had the Women's World Cup in Australia and that's sort of taken, and New Zealand, of course, that's overtaken pretty much all the media, a lot of the interest. So a lot of the deals and transfers have been sidetracked in one way where the clubs are just coming out with requirements. But for me, it's been quite busy, been giving a lot of advice, made some fantastic deals, and really looking forward to the new A-League season, but also the European seasons. Before we continue, I just want to make a quick shout out to a few people. This is our 6th, 7th or 8th episode of the Agent. 8th episode, all right. Time's gone quickly. I just want to firstly a shout out to a colleague of mine here in Australia, Mark Van Aken. He ran a very successful podcast called The Daily Football Show, and I used him a little bit as a soundboard about ideas and that. So thank you, Mark. Also, Jade, who came up or assisted with the name of this program, The Agent's Angle. And finally, a shout out to you, Jonathan, because without you and your hard work, your ability to get things well organized.
Right, let's just cut it short there. I'm not comfortable with praise, but thank you all the same, Peter, and thank you to you for finally convincing me to do this. Now, at the time this episode is available to the listeners, the transfer window in the major leagues across Europe would have closed over the last 48 hours or so. However, even though what many consider to be the main transfer windows being closed, we acknowledge some still remain open, both in the men's game and the women's game, as well as those free agent players that are still available. Now, just one of those windows that remains open at this time is the Saudi League, which has certainly got a lot of media attention in this window and over the last couple of weeks and months, and rightly so, with so much football talent that has moved there, including one of my favourite players and also one of my favourite people by all accounts, and that's Sadio Mane. Peter, just in general, a lot's been spoken about the Saudi League and these transfers going on. But what do you think of the impact the Saudi League has had in recent months and the knock-on effect it will have in regards to agents?
I think the impact is huge. I mean, we just have to look at some of the names that have moved there firstly. We've got Benzema, Kante, Mahrez. We've got Firmino, Brozovic, Koulibaly, Mendy, even Milinkovic-Savic. Obviously, Mbappe, that's pending, but there's some speculation about Al Hilal interested in making an offer there. And as you mentioned, Sadio Mane to Al Nassr too. I think the impact is huge because it's brought another player into the market in terms of the ability to pay big salaries and attract big names. Now, from the agent's perspective, the bigger agencies, and I know some of the bigger agencies have already been involved in deals, it's a game changer because it's not just the money, it's also the strategy where it's coming from. It's not coming solely from the big four Saudi clubs. It's also coming and driven by a Ministry of Sport and also the private investment funds. If I can say briefly about the strategy, from what I understand, and this is the research we've done, we may not be correct 100%, but this is sort of the observations. The Saudi clubs, or strategy, if I can call it that, focus on free transfers, so they don't need to always deal with clubs or release clauses. They go direct to the agents. So this is where the agents have a lot more influence, because it's not just the club, because most of these players are free or free of contract. The agents have a lot more influence in dealing on behalf of the player. And also there's influence from the Saudi ministry, who provide a lot of the funds in terms of the designated players, the big name players that they've been signing. So this is a game changer. And we've talked about China, which that happened a few years ago, but I think the Saudi model is very different. And in terms of discussing this further, we probably need an episode itself and bring in a guest who's been dealing with the Saudi transfer window into the show.
And just to add to that, Peter, we've actually had rumours at the time of recording in the last couple of hours that there's rumours about Neymar, and he's responsible for some of the biggest transfer figures around, and he may well be making the move to Saudi. So that'll be interesting. But what really fascinates me is what will happen in the coming weeks, because it's slowly gaining momentum. We're seeing higher profile players. We're not seeing those players who are arguably in the twilight of their careers or at the end of their careers. These are players who could still play at the top teams in the top leagues quite comfortably. So what's going to happen until the 20th of September? People can say that players in clubs are just being greedy when they get a move to the Saudi League. But what people forget, and this is when you're a true football purist, is that for the players, this is a job. For the club and the club owners, this is a business. They've got other commitments elsewhere, whether they be families or shareholders. And I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's wrong. So if a club or a player in the top leagues at some point, once the main windows have closed in places like England and Germany and Spain and Italy and France, that they get a silly money offer from a Saudi team, they will have to consider it, if not take it. Now, the difficulty is for such clubs is that if they take this big offer, once their transfer window is closed for a key player, they probably can't replace that player with the same caliber of player until January, because the window is closed. So is that gamble worth taking, especially for those teams who might be fighting relegation or fighting for a championship or something like Champions League place? Is that a gamble worth taking?
You're right. I mean, when transfer windows don't align and the Saudis have got a few more weeks to get transfers organised, it does affect a lot of teams. And I think a lot of teams will be worried. Obviously, if you've got a contracted player and without a release clause that's activated, then you might have a lot more control. But that is a worry. And I think we need to probably take this issue a little bit further. We have made some calls to several people to give us more insight into the Saudi League and, more importantly, the Saudi football agent market and the activities of agents in that market, as we're all relatively new to what it is to be an agent and operating under these circumstances. Some of those big agents will be coming on soon. We've actually put our calls out. Right now, everyone's busy. It's the transfer window. Everyone's trying to finalize some deals. But over the next few weeks or the next few months, we'll get some of those to explain the dynamics of the Saudi effect to our listeners and to us. Just one of the things we may look at, and I think it's important, is not just the transfers, but the aspects of work permits and the number of visas for players in different markets. For example, in relation to Saudi, how many non-Saudi national players can go work in the Saudi Pro League and other Gulf states? How many players at 5, 10? And whether those players, but not just players, coaches, managers, executives, or specialists being physios or sports science, how they get their visas. I think that's also an interesting topic. And that's what we've got on today. I think the United Kingdom, if we can move on from Saudi, is one such example which has changed in recent years.
Yeah, in the UK, we've gone across several evolutions of the work permit and visa restrictions when it comes to football. And that's just in recent times. And these are things that the agents and the clubs have had to try and keep up to date with. Now, the most recent changes came as a result of Brexit. Now, for those international listeners who don't know what Brexit is, it was the process following a national referendum in the UK to leave the European Union. That changed the rules on UK nationals working in the EU and vice versa, EU nationals working in the UK. Now, previously, there was free movement between the two jurisdictions, so that there was free movement of players across Europe. So now we have a system of GBEs. Now that stands for Governing Body Endorsements, to endorse players and others to work in football in the UK in certain roles. And that includes managers and coaches and sporting directors and players. Now, these are based on a specific set of agreed criteria between the National Football Associations and the Home Office. But it is far from simple. So we approached someone for some professional assistance on aspects of governing body endorsements, GBEs, in the UK for football.
Yes, we have. Governing body endorsement is an area where agents and football lawyers need to know, because the UK market, but more importantly, the English market, is very attractive to get a lot of players. And we've seen that with a lot of Australians going to Scotland recently, who have a little bit more relaxed GBE rules, but also a lot of players from Japan and other countries are becoming a lot more attractive under these rules. So I think it's time to go to our guest, Dev Kumar Parmar. Dev is an international experienced sports lawyer who's appeared in Court of Arbitration of Sports hearings, as well as having experience as a sports agent advisor, where he's advised elite players and coaches. Dev has represented both players and clubs and is instructed on several transactions as far afield as the Chinese Super League, the Indian Super League, as well as England and Italy, amongst others. Furthermore, Dev is the current FIFA Pro Bono Counsel and also the academic director of the Global Executive Masters in International Sports Law at the renowned Madrid-based Instituto Superior de Derecho y Economía, or in English, ISDE. He's also got his background in other sports, including being an arbitrator at the International Mixed Martial Arts Federation, an independent investigatory chamber member at the International Weightlifting Federation, and legal and governance director at the British Volleyball Federation. Welcome, Dev.
Oh, thank you, Peter. Thank you, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be with both of you today.
Well, let's get straight into our questions. And Dev, I want to turn to my first question about this GBE. In simple terms, and with a brief summary, can you unpack for our listeners the governing body endorsement process, or GBE, and how it impacts football players' eligibility to play in the UK, in particular England and Scotland, for instance?
That's a good starting point with regards to the regulations and understanding how and why they're here in the first place. Now, as a headline, what we've got to be aware of is that a player must accrue 15 points in order to be eligible to receive a governing body endorsement, which would then be sent over to the Home Office, which is the government body over here, that would then render a working visa for the player accordingly. Now, it's a very interesting question you ask, because if you speak to agents that haven't acted in England for several years, certainly in our experience, the common misnomer that is still thrown around is that they need to assess how many games the player has played internationally in the last couple of years and what percentage of the international games they took part in. Now, that is still one of the criteria that is looked at, but is not the sole criteria. That has expanded significantly, particularly over the last decade, and even more specifically since Brexit in the last few years, which has now, of course, rendered all of the European Union persons as foreign persons to the UK as well. So what we now have is quite a comprehensive, but at the same time, not overtly complex system, in my opinion, where there are a number of different criterions that have points attached thereto. So once the profile of the player is compiled and you're able to see how many points the player has accrued, if that player accrues 15 points from all of these different tables, then the player is automatically eligible to receive a governing body endorsement. If that player has not received 15 points, however, if the player has just fallen short, then there's also the ability for the player or the club on behalf of the player to render an appeal. So I think that's a very general overview for you before we go into appeals and how these things work.
If I'm an international agent outside of England and I want to put players forward to English clubs, in terms of preparing and helping the English club get a GB over the line or a work permit, what would you say are the 2-3 key elements that I need to be aware of to assist in getting a smoother GBE process through?
Now, I'm glad you've asked that, Peter, because it's important to be practical and it's important to be proactive in this sense. Now, the reality in our experience is that many of the clubs, even at the higher level, do not have the time, nor the inclination, nor the interest to do this kind of work themselves. Now, that's not a slur or a criticism of the clubs. The brutal reality is that clubs are being approached by agents, intermediaries, family members on 100 occasions every single day. Now, in order to try and ensure that your player or the hypothetical agent in this case, his or her player is considered, and to expedite the situation, I would strongly advise that you put together your statistical data with regards to the player's international involvement, the percentage of the international involvement over the last 24 months or whatever the relevant period for that age player will be, their club data for the last season, where their club is, which band their club would be in according to the regulations, and also whether that club has played in continental competition, whether it's CONMEBOL competition, whether it's AFC competition, CAF competition, UEFA, whatever it might be, because all of these things help to accrue points. Now, if the agent is in a position where he or she can come together with, let's say, a soft score, then that's going to be something that's going to ease the workload for the club and for anyone else moving forward. So I think it's important to be proactive in this kind of situation. And that proactivity would, in my view, not only help the club in terms of saving time, getting the whole process moving forward, if and when they do sign the player, but taking a step back, ensuring that any interest that the club might have in the player itself is reinforced. Because in this fast-paced industry, where a club has got to do something else before they actually look at the player from a purely technical perspective, it's simply less likely that they're going to be interested in that. They don't have time to waste with these kinds of things. So if you can go there with the full package and say that there's a good chance of this player being able to sign for your club, then it's going to significantly enhance your chances of moving forward.
There's quite a few platforms and systems available online and offline at the moment to calculate whether a player conforms with GBE requirements. Now, it's arguable how accurate those are and how up to date they are. But that aside, and the actual regulations themselves, in your opinion, what are the best ways for agents to stay informed about the updates and changes in GBE regulations? Like, I think we both appreciate they are going to evolve over time. They are going to change.
Yeah.
Just to ensure that they themselves are giving accurate guidance to their clients.
Yeah, the regulations are going to continue to develop. We've seen them already, yourself, myself, and Peter. We've seen them develop over the last decade in any case. And that's, in fairness, a sign of good governance, evolving to ensure the needs of the time. So we're going to see more and more changes over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years with regards to this. But I think in terms of keeping in touch with it, it's not too difficult. We live in the era of the internet and social media society. Pretty much everyone, particularly that is involved in national or international transactions, are connected to social media in some way. They have the ability to receive and to absorb notifications constantly. When news comes out with regards to these kinds of updates, that news is filtered around in a smaller scale and a wider scale, and people talk within the industry. Even 2 months ago, when we had this slight update, which eased the pathway for foreign players that wouldn't automatically get the 15 points criteria that we've been referring to, when that came out, it was all over the signal groups of our community within minutes. So it's quite easy, as long as you are not isolated from everyone else within the sector, to keep abreast of this kind of information. Of course, you must keep your eyes and ears open, but that information will be spread out quite quickly, like we've just seen with the June update.
You've been working and been involved in the agent side of football, as well as with other participants in football and other sports.
Yeah.
If there's one word you would use to describe the football agents industry as a whole, and I might give you a couple of words actually, and why, what would it be? What would be that one word or one phrase?
I think I'll stick to one word, if I may, Peter.
Please do.
Fragmented. I don't see...
Very interesting.
Unfortunately, I don't see any unity within the sector, in my opinion. And when I say any unity, I specify, I'm not just talking about having a utopian view where everyone is completely together, but I don't even see unity amongst smaller groups or stakeholders. There appears to be a different view, a different perspective, a different agenda amongst every single stakeholder that we come across. Now, that in itself, in my view, is not wrong. Of course, it's never wrong to have different views or different perspectives. That should be encouraged, in my humble opinion, in all forms of life. But then being able to come together to combine for the greater good, if one can put it that way. But with regards to agents, in football specifically, it's a completely fragmented ecosystem. One might not even be able to call it an ecosystem. It's just a space with a bunch of disassociated floating parts that are all separate from each other. And I do hope that this will somehow change in the future. Of course, we'll see how all of the litigious processes that are going on right now will pan out, and if that's going to have an impact on galvanizing some of the people in the ecosystem, bringing them together and forcing some sort of change. But at the moment, it's just a set of separate pieces.
Yes, let's hope for some unity. I mean, it's a very competitive industry, one of the most competitive in the world. Yep. Now, for this interview, we're focusing primarily on England or the UK regulations for GBEs. But I just want to focus a little bit internationally. How do these requirements, the GBE requirements, compare with other countries for football players, coaches, and managers? Now, I've had this experience where, for example, Thailand and Indonesia, some players have ended up on tourist visas and they're not appropriate to play in those countries and were found out. What have you seen in terms of work permit and visa issues?
As with regulation and law across the globe, we have startling and vast differences, and that's fine. That's the reality of our world as it is. I would say the GBE criteria is, in my experience, probably the most comprehensive. Certainly the most comprehensive that I can think of that's been put forward by a governing body. Now, we have other countries, I'll just throw out a couple of examples for conversational purposes, where the criterions are quite strict. For example, we can look at the P1 visa in the United States of America, but this is something that's been put forward by law, by the government. Then you can go to countries where it's comparatively easy to get a visa and there are no additional hoops or hurdles from the governing body to go through. And then we can go to the other end of the scale, or even past the scale, if we can put it that way, Peter, with the example that you gave, where in certain jurisdictions, without necessarily mentioning all of the jurisdictions that happens in, because it's not that uncommon, a player would sign a playing contract, often for not insignificant amounts of money, but they would go along to this country and they'd be on a tourist visa. They wouldn't actually have any legitimate right to go into this country and to be working, let alone to be working and earning a shed load more money than the national average.
Dev, at the time we're recording this, we're right in the cut and thrust of the transfer window. And sometimes you hear it reported via various parties and in the media that a player has completed a transfer subject to obtaining a work permit. Now, there's some confusion here, as there are with reports where they say subject to a medical, as some football regulations don't allow for that specific caveat. Is it a case that the terms of the transfer has been agreed, but not the actual transfer completed? I hope you can clarify that for the listeners.
100%. That for me is sloppy terminology. In the instance of that kind of terminology coming from one of the club parties involved in the transfer, that's extremely sloppy. And that's something that we would be flagging up immediately where we are instructed to deal with any communications. Furthermore, if it's not from the club parties that are involved, it could be sloppy terminology from the media outlets, whether it's a traditional media outlet or an online media outlet or whatever else it might be. But once you've signed up your terms, you are legally bound. That's it. Particularly from an employment perspective. From a FIFA perspective, you cannot have your employment contract subject to a successful medical or any of these terms. The ability to register a player is not something that should enable the club to terminate the player's playing contract. So what you would find in reality is that these would be transfers that are agreed subject to work permit, subject to successful medical, whatever else the requirements might be. So just latching on to what you said initially, Jonathan, it wouldn't be the case of a transfer being completed and executed, and then we're still kind of waiting on tenterhooks to see if the work permit comes through. Because as soon as we execute the contract, irrespective of whether a medical is passed or failed, you're legally bound to what you've signed to.
With that, Dev, we've got a lot of miscommunication and that sloppy language used in football. And sometimes that is used to, shall we say, raise the expectations and the ambitions of a player client or a coaching client. And it's a hurdle that agents have got to overcome. Now, from your experience, how can the agents best balance those expectations and ambitions of clients when it comes to this aspect of work permits and GBE criteria?
I think as an agent or an intermediary or a broker or whatever you want to refer to it as now, now we can broaden out for a moment. Don't have to be too specific. These individuals or these organizations that are in the position where they are acting for a player, they are advising a player, and they are supporting a player in a potential transaction, they have a duty to the player to be able to inform him or her of the reality of the situation without, to use a colloquial term, without gassing them up, without building their expectations too high. That's something that the agent or the intermediary is duty bound to do. And it's not always easy to have a tough conversation. It's not always easy to manage expectations, particularly where there might be exciting situations on the horizon. But this is the reality. You might not accrue 15 points, which means that we might then have to go into an appeal. And an appeal means that the club is going to have to spend for a gamble as to whether you're going to get through or not. Or it may be a case of simply saying, look, you don't meet the criteria. You don't even meet the catchment criteria to potentially go through an appeal. England is not the way for you at the moment. And saying, okay, if we can't get over to England right now, we're currently playing in the Kenya Premier League. We're 21 years old. Let's get over to Sweden, play there for a couple of seasons. If we can do really, really well, let's get over from Sweden to the Netherlands, play there for a couple of seasons. By the time you're 25, if you've had a tremendous career, let's get ourselves over to the Championship. The majority of strong operators in this industry will be quite candid about this kind of information with the way they manage their clients' expectations. But this is something that absolutely has to be done. Otherwise, you find yourself in a situation where you're trying to move a player over. The club likes the player. The club hasn't done its own diligence for a number of the reasons that we loosely touched upon. And then we get to the stage of discussing terms, and the club realizes that they're not going to pass the criteria, and then everyone walks away disappointed. And the agent has gotten to the point where they've annoyed the club, so they've also burnt one of their contacts. So it's a lose situation for absolutely everybody involved.
You mentioned roadblocks obviously that players and their agents could face with the GBE. Do you recall any case that's notable out there for someone overturning the initial decision?
There are several points that are, or several situations that are out there. I think one of the challenges that we've got to bear in mind, give a little bit more flavor and completion to this entire industry. All of these situations, albeit loosely referred to as sports law, are all private law mechanisms governed by private bodies and their own internal regulation mechanisms. Now, those regulation mechanisms might spread across an entire country because of the football system that it's overseeing, or it might spread across just one institution, like the private regulations of a club. Now, all of these matters, because they're private regulatory matters, none of the decisions by law have to be publicized. It's because of a push for transparency in the football industry that we are now seeing, let's say from the Football Association, where there are disciplinary matters, we're seeing written reasons for all of these disciplinary matters. But that doesn't necessarily extend to failed GBE criterions and then appeals for GBE, which have either been successful or not. This is something that also extends to the international side when we talk about FIFA and CAS, and particularly at CAS, where many of the decisions that come through the Court of Arbitration for Sport are not publicized, and there's a criticism behind that as well. So not to go too far off piece, but just to give a little bit of a flavor as to how this works. So it's not easy just to go onto Google, type in GBE appeal, and get a bunch of cases like we might in traditional law, we could go onto websites such as LexisNexis or Westlaw, and we can find every single reported case all across the UK, and also in some Commonwealth countries. Maybe, Peter, you've come across it in Australia. You've got similar sort of mechanisms as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, you got it's like the CAS cases or the DRC cases of FIFA, Dispute Resolution Chamber. The names are there, but seems like GB is a bit different.
Yeah, I mean, with FIFA, it's different now because the institution has pushed for transparency, and all of the cases that are rendered from the Dispute Resolution Chamber or from the PSC are actually put on the website. But with CAS, there's still disparity with regards to what is put out, what is not. And absolutely, with regards to the GBE, you don't always have that. So where we've come across information about players or coaches that have appealed and they've been successful or they've failed is more through either our own experience or colloquially when we're speaking to colleagues and we've received some information. The biggest one that I can think of right off the top of my head, going back a while now, and it was before this iteration of GBE, but still was in a situation where the automatic criteria had not been fulfilled and an appeal had to be rendered, was the current player at Tottenham, Richarlison, Brazilian national team player. He played previously for Everton, and prior to moving to Everton, he was at Watford Football Club. Watford had signed Richarlison from, I think it was Fluminense. He didn't fulfill the criterion at the time, and an appeal was rendered based on his immense potential and his ability to add value to English football at that time. The appeal was successful, and then he signed for Watford, and it was about a season or two later that he joined Everton Football Club in a big transfer. And then, of course, he came over from Everton to Tottenham for £60 million. That's one I can think of right off the top of my head. But again, to go back to the point, these matters are generally private, so it's not something that we would be able to find out easily and then start talking about a bunch of names that we've seen on Google, because you wouldn't know about these cases going on.
This is probably not a question, it's more of a scenario. A lot of Australian players and quite a few Japanese players have gone into Scotland, which I know has got a GBE system, but a little bit different to England. The Australian League and the Japanese League are ranked, I think, 6th tier for the GBE in England. Scotland, I believe, is the 3rd tier. Now, in terms of pathways into England, would Scotland be a better pathway where you come into Scotland, you play a season or two, and that way you can springboard into England? Not to avoid the GBE, but just easier to get a work permit. You got any thoughts on that?
As you said, it's not about avoiding GBE per se. It's just about the way the regulations are applied in Scotland as opposed to the way they're applied in England. We were involved in a matter fairly recently with regards to a young player that signed for a very big team in Scotland. The player came from outside of the UK, had no real background in football, if one can put it that way. A lot of ability, a lot of potential, demonstrated this potential at academies and trials in the UK, but had no real background that a points accrual could be based on. Now, were this player to have signed for a big club in England, it would have been nigh impossible, according to the GBE regulations, for him to have signed. However, with Scotland, the criteria that needed to be fulfilled was failed. An appeal was made, and the player was successful on appeal, and the player has signed now for this club. So it's not about avoiding the GBE per se. We still have regulations in Scotland, but those regulations, one might say, are a little bit more relaxed than in England. And at the same time, the way these regulations are applied in Scotland is also a little bit more relaxed. The ability to argue, players' ability to come in, to acclimatise and to add value to the Scottish League is something that one can argue with a little bit more ease than they could if they were trying to argue that the player's going to come in and make a big difference to Chelsea or to Manchester United. It's ironic because having worked in the Japanese J-League and in the K-League, J-League and K-League are band 5 leagues according to the GBE criteria, but they are very, very strong leagues. We must never, ever take that for granted just because we are proximal to the English League and the Scottish League over here. but it can be a bit of a springboard to come into England. If you come along and you spend a couple of years in Scotland, you've already got your working rights in the UK. You've demonstrated your ability to live and work in the UK. And because of your proximity, clubs in England are watching you. So yeah, it definitely can be a springboard. It's not a loophole. It's not an avoidance point, because you still have to go there and do the hard yards for 1 or 2 seasons at the very, very least. But it's certainly a springboard to getting into England.
Dev, we've already covered that the GBE regulations have gone through quite a few transformations over the last few years, and they're going to be refined. They're going to change over future years. What future trends or changes do you foresee with the regulations, and how can agents proactively prepare to navigate these changes? Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, funnily enough, I was thinking about this several months ago, and not for one moment to come across as Mystic Meg for some of your older listeners, but I kind of foresaw that there had to be some sort of relaxation akin to the notification we received in the middle of June, where the Football Association, in line with the Home Office, put forward this alleviation of the strict framework to enable Premier League and Championship teams to sign up to 4 players that don't meet the automatic criteria, and for League One and League Two teams to sign up to 2 players that don't meet the automatic criteria, with the potential for this number to fluctuate depending on how many English players that the teams play over the next 1 or 2 or 3 seasons. Now, the full parameters of how that all works, I'm sure, is something that will need refinement over the next 1, 2, or 3 years. But the ideology that there is this, now I'll use the term, this almost loophole, or this almost gateway for a player of outstanding ability from Venezuela, or a player of outstanding ability from Georgia, to come along and join an English club directly, I think is great, and is something that we needed to do. But there will be situations where there is an individual who is strong enough to come along and add value, either on the pitch or on the touchline, but would not be able to because of the strictness of the criterions in place. This will now give English football the ability, if they can demonstrate that these individuals are of exceptional talent, to compete with your Serie A, because where Maradona has gone directly to Napoli and he's had an absolutely tremendous season, a player from his wonderful nation wouldn't automatically be given that ability to come over to England. Or Caicedo, who's just now become our record transfer in English football, he would have been able to come directly to England with this kind of relaxation in place, rather than having to go over to Beerschot first and then signing over for another club, and then Brighton, and then over to Chelsea. So I think this is something that needs to be in place. The ability to fortify and to retain the strength of the English football leagues, to retain the valuation of the English football leagues, and to try and keep it right at the top of the tree, but at the same time having an avenue for exceptionally talented individuals to still come in, so that they aren't lost out to Serie A, to Ligue 1, to La Liga, or to any other league. They can be brought into England immediately.
Don't worry about mentioning Mystic Meg. I went even further back on a previous episode when I referenced Smokey and the Bandit. So that just shows how old I am. Final question for you, Dev. From your knowledge and experience of the football agents world and the industry itself, what would be your wish for the future of the football agents world?
Unification. And going right back to the start, Peter was very, very kind, and he humbled me when he outlined all of the institutions that have been crazy enough to appoint me as some sort of arbitrator or director, and one of those happens to be in boxing and combat sports. And we see something similar in boxing. We see fragmentation of the industry, particularly on the professional side, with multiple governing bodies and competition organizers struggling to unify themselves with each other. And I use that analogy and I try and apply it into the agents game. That disenfranchisement, that fragmentation, that disassociation from each other is to the detriment of the ecosystem. It's to the detriment of the players. It's to the detriment of football overall. the agents, the intermediaries, the brokers, whatever we want to refer to them as. They are part of the football family, for use of FIFA parlance, irrespective of what anyone suggests or what anyone says otherwise. They always have been part of the football family, and they always will remain part of the football family. But I would like to see some unity within that family. It's probably a bit of a pipe dream, particularly with some of the distinctly different viewpoints that we've got within the sector at the moment, and the distinctly different agendas that we've got in the sector at the moment. But ideally, if there was one thing that I could see in the future of the agents world, I would love to see your Jonathan Bookers and your Peter Paleologos be coming together and working alongside other agents' bodies, and everyone working in tow with each other. Of course, airing out their views, their opinions, but having a unified stance with regards to how things genuinely move forward, and setting up a singular union representative of all of the agents around the world, to put forward the interests of the agents and to be an effective stakeholder when sitting at the table having discussions with FIFA, with UEFA, and everyone else. Again, it's a bit of a pipe dream, but that's the way I would like it to be.
Well, we keep dreaming. We aim for it. And I think it's a very good way to end this interview, Dev. You know, Peter and I are working together. We'll admit we don't agree on everything. The difference is that we listen to one another. We take on board one another's opinions, and quite often we change our opinions based on what the other represents, or we come up with a solution or a different approach or a different opinion on which we can agree, or we agree to disagree. Yeah. So thank you for that. And thanks for taking the time to come on the Agents Angle and share your knowledge with us and the listeners, as I know you're very busy, especially at this time of year, as you are throughout the year. So your time and knowledge is greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.
Now, all very interesting there from Dev, but depending on who you talk to in the UK, and in particular the football world, you get a differing opinion on the variations to governing body endorsements and work permits in football over the years. I personally believe this system is a fairer one all round for both players coming to the UK and also the development pathways for domestic players as well as clubs. Some may well disagree with me, particularly from the aspect that it restricts a recruitment pool for British clubs compared to previous frameworks where we had the free movement of workers across Europe. Now, these systems will need refining over time to make it fair. There are some anomalies in there with this new system, and we all have to adapt to the changing industry. Plus, no doubt people will find loopholes in the system, which will then need to be addressed. But every country will need to strike that fine balance between an attractive league or leagues and developing homegrown football talent. Now, Australia has been well known for its relatively tough border controls and immigration requirements, not just for football, for some time. But if Australia itself, in football terms, Peter, seems to be at a crossroads in so many ways at the moment in striking that balance between having an attractive league that draws fans and football development pathways for talent, not least with the expansion of Australian football and the possibility of new league on the cards. So just interested to get your perspective. How does that expansion and the immigration restrictions impact on Australian football ambitions?
That's a very interesting question. There's two aspects to it. In terms of expansion, we've got the A-League, which is very similar to the MLS in terms of a franchise league with no promotion relegation. There's been discussion of further expansion of that league. But in terms of Australia, for that league, it's 5 visa players, which is pretty easy. As a visa player, if you come to Australia, getting the work permit's not that difficult, but it's 5 international players. We've also looked at a second division that might be on the cards. There's a lot of discussion on that. It was earmarked for March next year, and that will be sort of semi-pro, but moving to the professional realm, and it will actually provide a lot of younger players with a pathway. However, it looks like we're not sure if it will go ahead then. There hasn't been a lot of movement, but maybe because, as I said before, we've got the Women's World Cup, a lot of things focus on that. And then the second division and expansion may happen before. But the interesting about Australia is it attracts certain type of players, and a lot of those players, international players, quite a few of them stay in Australia and become coaches. One or two have become agents, or they become administrators, or even they become commentators. So we have our immigration policy, Australia being a very successful immigration nation. It works really well with football because it's not just about the footballing, but also bringing family and bringing skills here. When agents talk about bringing players to Australia, that's part of the sell. The sell is what happens also after, the lifestyle and the opportunities.
That opens up another subject as well, doesn't it? Because it's one thing actually getting your visa or your governing body endorsement to be employed by a club in football. But getting to play in a specific league or competition is a second hurdle for agents to look at for their playing clients. Now, there's plenty of instances now where we have homegrown rules across many leagues. And you spoke about quotas. Well, there's homegrown rules across European leagues and many leagues around the world. So even if somebody gets a work permit to be signed for a club, it doesn't mean they necessarily can be registered for that club in a specific competition. So that's another thing for agents to consider when they're looking at the transfer world for their clients, whether they be a club or player. So it's all very, very complicated. And then again, that's another subject where we've got somebody coming in to talk about homegrown rules, not only because of the rules themselves, because there's some commentary and criticism at the moment in Europe that homegrown rules and quotas in football actually contravene European law. So we're going to leave that for somebody specialist in the future.
I think that's a good idea. But if I can just pivot before we close on one thing about international player rules, work permit and homegrown. Very interesting here in Asia. I'm based in Australia, but in Japan, the J1 league, the top tier of Japan football, has no limits on foreign players. Each club, though, can have a maximum of 5 foreign players in their match day squad. So there is that limitation. However, you talk about homegrown and you talk about international and visas and work permits. The J League has set up partner nations, MOUs, memorandums of understanding with certain countries or football associations. They include Thailand, Vietnam, Myanmar, Malaysia, Cambodia, Singapore, Indonesia, and Qatar, who don't actually even come under the criteria of 5 minimum players in the matchday squad. So if we're talking about homegrown rules in Japan, technically a team can field 11 players without a Japanese player. If they have the 5 international foreign players, say European or Brazilian or something, and 1 or 2, 3, 4, 5 players from those countries I just mentioned. So it's very interesting that homegrown can mean a lot of things, but here in Asia, it's a little bit different. But yeah, as you said,
it's a fascinating point, Peter, because that shows that understanding and that cooperation between those nations. And that's going to help their development, not just of their players, but also of their leagues. I think it's a really interesting route to take. Whether I could see the competition between European nations, seeing them follow a similar route, is, for me, very unlikely.
Agree. I mean, Europe is a different type of environment, different type of operation, and really it's a little bit more technical there. What are homegrown players? UEFA talks about association-trained players and club-trained players, but as you mentioned before, let's bring someone on in your future podcast who's a specialist on the homegrown rules. But the time is now to bring this episode of The Agent's Angle to a close. Thank you all for listening. We're getting some great feedback and ideas for future podcasts. Please keep sharing those. All the information available to contact us on our socials. Thank you. Bye from me for now.
Bye, everyone. Take care of yourselves.
The purpose of the Agent's Angle podcast is to provide news, information and facilitate discussion on regulatory matters, policies, business trends and issues affecting football agents worldwide. The opinions and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only and should never be considered legal or professional advice. Furthermore, the views expressed by guests are their own and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Thank you for listening.